Okay guys, I hope you've been watching part 1 and part 2. This is part number 3 of our jig series. Today we're going to be covering bladed jigs, which are your chatterbaits, those types of baits. And we're also going to be covering the swim jigs, which is just essentially your jig head with something on the back of it, you know, with the skirt. So let's get into it. Everybody, thank you for tuning in to the part 3, the final part in our jig series. Today we're going to be talking about the 5th jig in the series, the bladed jig or the chatterbait, and number 6, your typical swim jig. So when we talk about a bladed jig or a swim jig, we're talking about something like this. It's got the blade on the front that when you're retrieving it, it wobbles back and forth. It's got a skirt. It's got a swim jig type head on it, and then it's got a big stout hook like this for working it through some thick cover. Now the way I like to rig these is you can do it a variety of different ways. You can put Kitex on the back or small swim baits. I like to expose that hook. For me, this is a preferred method. I'm going to run a beaver on here sideways right down the middle until it gets to that middle point, and then I'm going to pop it back through. I'm going to run it up on there just like that, where it's nice and straight, you see. And now, more than likely, depending on the day and everything else, I'm probably going to rip those small little side appendages off, discard them, and I may leave this thing connected where it really coming through the water is going to really kick really hard like a tail, and it really works well. So that's how I like to rig them. Again, you can rig them with a Kitex or a swim bait of some sort, but that's the bladed jig or the chatterbait. Now the second one is your typical swim jig. So this is just a typical swim jig with a swim jig head. It's got that weed guard on there. It's got that really stout heavy hook. And again, with these you can put a lot of different things on the back. In this case, I like to run a smaller Kitex. I mean, you can run big ones. Big baits catch big fish, but in this case, small baits catch more fish. So you run that sucker on there just like you would, push it up on there, you get that great looking profile. I mean, this is a bluegill pattern. It really works well. The fish just chew it, and it's pretty simple. Now, a couple of honorable mentions that aren't on here. People will often talk about fishing a shaky head like a jig. You can throw it up there, a little lightweight bait, little light hook, flipping it into those cover and everything else. And again, everybody's going to call a different thing and fish it a different way. Texas rig with a pegged hook, or a pegged weight could be considered a jig of sorts. But really, for me, it's got to have a skirt, it's got to have a blade or a head, that solid lead head that's connected to the hook. So, a shaky head may qualify under certain circumstances, in the same regards as a tube might. But this is my opinion when it comes to the different types of jigs and how I like to fish them. So, all right, the first bait today is going to be the bladed jig. Now, this is a D&M Piranha swim jig. It's one of my favorites. Great color patterns. I've got it paired up with a Reaction Innovation Sweet Beaver on the back. It really kicks really well, like a fish swimming. You can use Kitex. You can use other swim baits of your choice. But in this particular case, I like to use a beaver. So let me show you how I fish this thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast this over this point here. I'm going to let it sink a little bit, and I'm going to slowly roll that sucker in where I'm feeling that chatter really good. Look at the tip of that rod really vibrating. That's what you get. It's the 21st century, spinner bait, if you will. It's really vibrating through the water really hard. Now this thing, now I just hit some debris. When it does that, I just give the rod a little pop. It'll usually clear pretty well. And then we're going to bring it in and we're going to start over. Now the great thing about the bladed jig is you can fish it over weeds. The fish will really target it post spawn, as it looks really like a bait fish coming through the water. And the thing you have to know about these things is when they eat it, one of the biggest indications, especially in a pre-spawn mode, of you getting bit is you won't feel that vibration anymore. So your bait will quit vibrating, then you'll feel the weight right after that, and that's usually a good indication you've got a fish that just sucked that sucker in. I have gotten bit on these things where they just eat it a ton, and it feels like a ton, just crush it, and you know, obviously that's a good indication too. So this is how I fish this. I throw it over rocks, I throw it, you know, on the front edge of weed lines or tule lines or, you know, cattails, any of those types of things. The one downside to these is it will get caught up in the weeds, you know, especially if it's a mossy weed, you know, stuff like that. It'll get around that blade and it'll make that blade ineffective. It won't work. So, you know, this is definitely a hard bottom spot, you know, someplace where you can get on a good line or a good edge or fish it over rocks and that kind of thing. So once again, the first one today, number 5 in our series, is the bladed jig. So for our last jig in our jig series today, I'm going to be talking about the non-bladed, just a swim jig. Now this is I believe this is a revenge jig. It's just a jig head with a skirt with the brush guard, and I've got it backed up with a Kitech. And so the way I like to fish this thing is it just varies on the lake. This isn't the greatest lake for doing this because there's not a lot of weeds or anything. But I like to cast it over a point. I like to let it get down usually into the weeds if there's weeds, and I just slow roll it back like I would almost a swim bait, right? So I'm going to keep my rod pointed right at the line. I'm going to keep it parallel to the water, and every now and again I might give it a little pop just to give it a little bit of flair. Just think about it, if you're reeling it back slow, that Kitech's kicking really hard on the back, and you know, ultimately what you're going to be doing is making that skirt just have a little bit more flare. Now, if you look down here in the water, you know, if you can see that, the way it's coming through the water, you know, when you pop it, it really gets that good flare going, right? So we're going to cast it out again, right through this mud line. Mud line is always a good thing to fish. You know, fish like to feel comfortable in there. So, you know, when you're fishing through a dark mud line that's darker than the rest of the water, the one thing you have to remember is that you've got to have something that's giving off a vibration, a scent, or a sound, right? Because they're not going to visually be able to eat your bait typically unless it hits them right in the nose. So again, I'm going to fish this thing right over weeds, right through weeds. I will throw this in some of the thickest things you can imagine on a heavy braided line, and I'm going to just rip it through. Just rip it through. It ain't gonna get caught up too much. It comes through pretty clean. It wobbles really well. And as those fish, you know, they're in that thick stuff in certain times of year, so you gotta really look for them. So that's the last jig in our jig series today, is the straight up swim jig. All right, guys and gals, that's it. 6 of the most primary jigs that you can possibly use. We covered 2 in each video. You know, obviously we did some more detailed stuff and showed you kind of how we rig them and all that, you know, not on the water. But, you know, the thing about a jig is they're fish that they catch fish year round. You can use them in deep water, you can use them in shallow water, you can use them around docks or structure or rock or grass. They are probably the most versatile bait on the market because of the different things you can do. So if you've never fished a jig, go buy some, give them a try, tie them up, use some basic information and go give them a whirl. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hit the like and subscribe button, watch all 3 videos. They're gonna be here or wherever I put the previous one. So keep watching, stay tuned for more videos, and thanks for watching.